And I feel really honored to have the opportunity to come spend some time with you. I've heard much about the organization. I've watched several of the events on the web, but I haven't had the opportunity to attend any in person yet. So I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to be here today. I'd just like to say a couple of things as I get started. Now, first off, I have my standard disclaimer. Yes, because I wanted to speak more candidly, and I will talk about U.S. policy. I feel free to sort of criticize it in an academic sense if need be, but just so everybody's clear that the views here expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the Army or the Army War College. But like I said, we are being recorded. That's fine. Just a matter of sort of academic freedom and make sure that we can have a kind of open, candid discussion, and I look forward to that. So what I've done is I've set up several slides, and about 28 that I will go through. I have some in backup that might come up in the discussion that I may pull up. But what I intend to do is kind of set the stage for what I hope to be a good set of questions and discussion. And I mentioned the point about discussion. When I look around the audience, I'm also mindful. I see our Army War College Ambassador, Diplomatic Advisor to the Commandant, Ambassador Dan Shields, who just spent 6 months in Southeast Asia working on, and he's been ambassador to Brunei. He's been in South Asia in East Asia for many years. So there's some things I'm mindful of. I bet you he knows better, has better answers than I do on some of these things. I may just say, let's give him the mic to answer some of those. But I know there's also a lot of other expertise in the room. But I will say, and I just want to clarify too, some people who do these are, foreign area officers or very much a regional specialist for that region. And I cannot make that claim. I'm a strategist, really kind of a generalist first and foremost. However, in 2006, my very first assignment as a U.S. Army colonel, I was sent to Korea to be chief of plans for the U.S. forces in Korea. And having only been there for an exercise once earlier in my career, and otherwise having spent a lot of time in Europe and in the Middle East, I began to look much closer at how things worked in particularly Northeast Asia and East Asia more broadly. And of course, there's no way to think hard about the issues in Korea or anywhere else in East Asia without trying to understand China. So although I had some familiarity before that time, I have spent a lot of my time since 2006 looking hard at how to understand the People's Republic of China. And probably in good fashion, having taught war and strategy at the United States Military Academy and then at the Naval War College, one of our touchstone texts is the classic Chinese work by Sun Tzu, which is one of the most important things is to know your enemy and know yourself. And so in that fashion, having been guided to understand, and I don't want to say they're not our enemy, and let's be clear about that right now. And our national security strategy takes a fairly negative tone towards them, which the Chinese were very quick to pick up on. But they are not an enemy. They are not an adversary. They are a competitor. We are concerned. But I would say, in terms of understanding who you are dealing with, the guidance from Sun Tzu is very wise. And so looking to make sure we understand China and, frankly, engaging with the Chinese, that they understand us. Because we're two very important countries in the world who have a lot to do with how things turn out in the future. And I think there's many pathways forward that are very positive that do not entail war by any means. But there are some concerns about paths that might lead to something much more dramatic, much more dangerous, much more damaging, frankly, for the entire world, not just our two countries. And so those are the things that I would submit we want to avoid, but that takes a lot of understanding of each other. And just to add one last point about context before I get going. So partly when I was offered the opportunity for this talk several months ago, we had just sort of put the final touches on our arrangements to go to China. And so when I said, great, then I would like the Friday right after we get back from China so that I could speak on that particular topic. So from the 12th through the 17th of January, last week, I was part of a group, and I'll have a picture here in a little bit towards the end, from the United States Army War College that participated in an official military-to-military engagement with counterparts from the People's Liberation Army, one of their educational entities, their Academy of Military Science. And so we were in Beijing, China for this visit. Last December, or December 2016, I should say, they were here in Carlisle, literally in this room, when we did our third U.S. Army War College People's Liberation Army mill-to-mill engagement. This was the fourth, and this was the second time we had gone back to China to meet with them. So we were there in China at the beginning of last week, and then along with a group, and that was faculty and 4 of our students from the current resident War College class that engaged with the Chinese, exchanging views. with the Chinese about a lot of key security issues. And again, more of which later. And then I took 3 of the students on to Korea, where we joined another group working on a research project about Korea stabilization following however it may happen, if North Korea were to collapse or disappear, or just a matter of how would reunification on the Korean Peninsula look and what sort of challenges and what might the United States be called upon to do. So I was in China and then in South Korea last week. So in that regard, I have some fresh information. But again, I think I'll focus on the China part here and lay out a bit of context, and then, like I said, look forward to the questions that we have. All right, one thing that I find is kind of helpful when thinking about China. It's a book I read many years ago called A Millennium. And I'm trying to remember the guy's first name now. I have it written down. Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who is a scholar at Oxford, wrote a book called Millennium. And it's a very nice history of the last 1,000 years. It was written in 1995. So in the wake of the Cold War, you sort of think of how to look at the world. He wrote a very interesting history and sort of posited this framework where what if some galactic museum keeper who was going through the universe, sort of looking at different planets and sort of summarizing the history, and what would stand out if you're looking at the Earth in the last 1,000 years. And one of the things that comes fairly clear to mind, and this is talking about 1000 AD up till 1995 when he was writing, is the important role of China and what was going on, that civilization in East Asia. Clearly, European civilization, Islamic civilization, African civilizations, others that were prominent, but really the one that stood out in that millennium was China and the civilization of East Asia that the Chinese had built over thousands of years. And towards the end, he comes back to that theme and sort of sensing that China and the East is coming back in ways that we probably need to be mindful of. And I think that's, again, that 1995, over 20 years ago, but I think we've seen that sort of insight was a fairly astute one that I think is wise for us to continue to think hard about how to understand East Asia, the world as a whole, but I think China as a very important player in that. And I'll lay out several slides to sort of set that context. But I think that idea of how to think about what has happened in some of the broader context, so that certainly frames the way the Chinese think of the world. We Americans, I should say, as a relatively new country, tend to think of a lot of these things as unwritten, and we're determining where things go. The Chinese have a little bit broader sense of the way things have been and how they should get back to the way they were, which in many regards is very favorable for them. And so that comes up again and again. This is the outline that I will follow, and these just sort of summarize the key topics that we'll walk through. And again, some of these are just sort of slides and graphics and some basic information, and then I'll throw out some last slides on implications for the United States. But again, a lot of this is meant to sort of prompt discussion. So to start with, I want to lay out just kind of a sort of a bottom line up front when we think about China-U.S. relations, if there's sort of a simple baseline, maybe to think through some key elements that help sort of talk about where we are. And I'll be, as an international relations scholar, and the theories there, one of the prominent ones in international relations is a balance of power, which can tend to be very sterile and get into bean counting that suggests the answer. And I'll state up front that although that's an important way to start, my sense is that ideas matter an awful lot, and that the United States has been motivated by a set of values that means that we tend to approach international relations a little bit differently. So although there's a lot of these sort of touchstones of power, and power certainly and some of these key dynamics matter, I'd highlighted in the background there, and when we think about what it means, that these ideas about what you do with this power is crucial to how the United States, and frankly how China also sees the world. And I think that's where we'll see some interesting tensions, but some interesting overlaps as well. But to sort of set the stage, some of the things we know about China is, by far the largest, or not by far, it is the largest country in the world by population, slightly ahead of India. And in fact, I believe the estimates are in about a decade or so, India is likely to overtake China as the most populous nation on the planet. But China right now is the largest, over 1.3 billion people, over four times larger than the United States. And in fact, the United States itself is the third most populous planet, or country on the planet. So very large countries in terms of their demographics. In terms of their economics, gross domestic product, China and the United States are number 1 and number 2. Now, if you go to the CIA World Factbook, and that's the main data source that I use, it's an open source thing, so this is not classified material. But if you go to the web, you can access the CIA World Factbook, and it'll lay out a lot of these numbers. There is a note specifically right next to China, although they make it more broadly elsewhere, that purchasing power parity measures of gross domestic product are the more accurate. And that's because the other measure we use is one they call the exchange rate, the one that says EX underneath, GDP by exchange rate. By that measure, in terms of actual value of Chinese current, the value of the Chinese economy measured against the exchange rate, meaning the US dollar versus the Chinese yuan, that one actually says we're about twice as large as China. But remember, they fixed their exchange rate by fiat. And most believe that understates fairly dramatically what the actual value of the Chinese economy is. What purchasing power parity represents is if you go try to buy the same basket of goods in China that you might in the United States, which is the baseline. That's why the United States GDP is identical by both measures, because the United States is the baseline for purchasing power parity. If you try to buy a similar basket of goods in China, they're cheaper, meaning your yuan goes a lot further than you might expect in terms of what you buy in China. By that measure, China surpassed the United States in gross domestic product in terms of the size of the economy in 2013. And so China has the world's largest economy. Per capita-wise, obviously a major difference in terms of where the United States is per capita, very wealthy, developed country. The Chinese still insist, and they're one of the key things when they talk about who they are economically. They say they tend to still call the United States the world's largest economy or strongest economy, and China, they refer to themselves as the world's largest, strongest developing economy. And they still very explicitly see themselves as a developing economy, and that's part of their charter to their own people to increase development, and explicitly going towards the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2049, identifying that as the point when they should be a fully sort of developed economy. But right now they see themselves as a developing economy, and that's reflected in their GDP per capita. They're growing very strongly, 6.8%. Now for about 3 decades they were growing at almost 10% a year. This tapered off in the late 2000s. The economic crisis that hit in 2008 hit the entire world, did not hit China as badly as the United States. But it did, their growth rate has come down a bit since. So now down from double digits down to about 7% the last several years, but that's still an extremely robust growth rate. And the United States right now, and this has been steady for a few years, at about a little bit over 2%. We have the first and third largest militaries in the world. The Chinese, in fact, are reducing the size of their military. And it has been reducing in size for several decades. They were a very infantry, manpower-intensive military force. They are moving to be a much more professional, they have a lot more capital equipment, ships, aircraft, tanks they've built to, and they've drawn down heavily in terms of the number of soldiers in particular. But they are still the largest active military in the world. They spend about a third of what the United States does for their defense on an annual basis. But you can see that's a much lower proportion, less than 2%. Some talk about, or we have talked about NATO members who should live up to their commitment to spend at least 2%. Well, the Chinese don't spend 2% of their economy. We are one of the largest percentage in terms of the large countries, at over 3%. But nonetheless, this is from a growing economy, and that number has been going up in terms of what they've been spending on defense. I'll come back to that later. Government, we are a liberal democratic republic. That's not, not liberal in the liberal conservative. That's liberal in that sort of global sense of human or individual rights of citizens and their ability to make choices politically, economically, in terms of their choices. So that's more of a generic statement of the type of political system we have. The Chinese are communist, explicitly by name, but their economic system begs a lot of questions about what communism means. They tend to refer to it as socialism with Chinese characteristics, which tends to really mean the government maintains authoritarian control, single-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. But in fact, they have what we would recognize as a pretty strong market economy that really it differs very little from many of the sort of more traditional capitalist economies of the West or the United States. Certainly much different than what the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries had during the Cold War. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon since the 1980s. But finding socialism with Chinese characteristics, the Chinese characteristics, in most cases when you read, if you substituted sort of capitalist market economy, that's usually what it really means how we would understand what's going on with their economy. But for them, it's still communist. They still cite Marxist, Leninist thought. They cite Mao Zedong. They cite, the classic communists, of literature. But when they talk about with Chinese characteristics, that's been kind of that economic getting prosperity in ways that they think are appropriate under the guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. Area-wise, we're almost the same size as China. They are slightly smaller than us. The largest country in the world is Russia. The next is Canada, then the United States, and then China. Which I find one of the things to point out is when you look at that population, by the way, the United States has more arable land than China does. So if anybody wonders, what overpopulation of the United States would look like, it's like, well, you could probably be at least 4 times larger before we're going to have any problems if you see how China has managed. But just the very similar land area. And to include areas like Alaska that's it doesn't have a lot of habitable area. They have large deserts, the Tibetan Plateau, that aren't particularly habitable. Now, one major difference that stands out is the actual formal alliances. China has one ally. They do not have any troops there. They do not exercise with them routinely, haven't in decades, but on paper, they have an official military alliance with North Korea, which they tend not to like to acknowledge, although they have renewed it. They renew it at 20-year intervals, and they did renew it in 2001. So it is an official alliance. The United States has more than 40 alliance partners, NATO members being the most prominent, but in Asia, the Republic of Korea, South Korea that is, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and I'll talk more about them in just a little bit. Both are members of the United Nations now, and both are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. But there is one caveat in there that the Chinese are very sensitive to. That is, when we formed the the United States and the Allied powers in World War II created the United Nations, we gave China a seat on the one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. You're probably familiar with France, the United Kingdom, Russia, the United States, and China. At the time, that was nationalist China with Chiang Kai-shek. When the Chinese communists won the revolution in 1949, we insisted that the real government of China was still the nationalists who had decamped to Taiwan. And until 1971, Taiwan, the nationalists, held that seat in the United Nations and at the Security Council. So not until 1971 was the People's Republic of China able to assume their seat in the Security, over 20 years after they were founded. Still a sore point with them, but that's sort of one of those digs or points of humiliation that they'll tend to point to in their history that's worth noting. But they are permanent members of the Security Council with a veto in this era. All right, I'll go through a few things, and again, some of this I'll go through fairly quickly. Happy to come back to it during the questions or discussion, but I think this helps set some of the context as we think about them. Now, when you go to find a map, and I did this, looking on the internet, said I want a good map to show China and the United States, and of course, most of our maps tend to put the Atlantic in the middle, and the date line is way off on the fringes, so you kind of see things trail off at Alaska on the left hand of the map, things trail off, just past China on the right side of the map. So finding one that puts the Pacific in the center took a little bit of looking. But if you notice, this is the entire world. So the Atlantic is much thinner than the Pacific, or much narrower than the Pacific. So this we see on both sides of the Pacific. But I want to add a couple of things that sort of show, we both call ourselves Pacific powers, and China acknowledges that the United States is a Pacific power. And although they'll complain about our meddling in East Asia, they still acknowledge that we have interest in the Asia Pacific. Now, partly these are, the first set of circles, these are parts of the United States itself. As you probably recognize, Alaska and the Aleutians as they trail out toward the west, and the Hawaiian Islands out to Midway in the middle here. And then don't forget, the United States has the territories of Guam and the Marianas, which are here in the Western Pacific. That's U.S. territory. Then add in formal U.S. treaty allies in the region. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan through what says the Taiwan Relations Act. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. The Philippines and Thailand and Australia all formal U.S. treaty allies. And when you look at this way, and I haven't even sort of gone into Central Asia, where the Chinese tend to point out we've got troops in Afghanistan, troops in Iraq, we have some bases up in Central Asia. So if there's a sense of, are we surrounding or trying to contain them, tends to be one of their points. That so although it may look like we're on both sides of the Pacific, we've got a fairly strong set of forward elements on China's side of the Pacific, if you will. Another just piece of context to sort of set the scene in terms of, and this is historically, looking back, and I talked about how the Chinese sort of have seen themselves, and by the way, the name in Chinese for China is, Zhongguo, the middle kingdom or middle country. The idea that they were the middle of the universe. Most countries have a version of that. They're the people and everybody else are barbarians. Chinese had a strong version of that for many years, and they even talked about foreign policy as, in large regard, as barbarian management, how you manage all the unwashed beyond the fringes of the Chinese empire. When you go back to the 1750s, when China was sort of at its peak and realized where they were, I mean, over a third of the world's population resided in China. These were very advanced. This was a very advanced society. And then their decline, or the areas where they were the greatest frictions and their decline began, was really kind of in the 1840s. We'll talk more about that. But just clearly, we didn't even exist in terms of there was Europe, obviously, I didn't include that, but in terms of the North America colonized by the Europeans, later becoming the United States, this is the population shown over here. And I showed this for a couple reasons. One, to sort of illustrate where China has been and partly their sense of influence they've had for a long period of time, and partly our emergence. And if I go back to 1950, that post-World War II era, when the United States was really kind of at its peak of influence in the international community, you would note that we were only about 6% of the world's population. In an immediate aftermath of World War II, when most of our competitors, frankly, had been devastated by the war economically in ways that we did not suffer, the United States commanded over 50% of or about 50% of the world economy. Frankly, that's really kind of an unsustainable. If you use a basic regression to the mean, what should any basic population be able to achieve? If you remember, our percentage of the global economy is up around 1/5, for still less than 5% of the world's population. But the sense that China is now coming back to sort of regressing back to the mean. If you just sort of one for one, if every human being is about as equally productive anywhere on the planet, China's economy should match up with about their 20% of the population. They're getting back to that at this point. It's a little bit different about sort of the United States, which has done exceedingly well compared to some of the basic resources and demographics, resources and other things that are available to us. And the Chinese who, compared to where they have been historically, really aren't as strong as they've been in the past. I mentioned about how populous China is, but one of the key things about China is most of their population, and actually I was trying to get a verification. I know this is at least 90%, this line, but I recall in another one I believe it's more than 95% of the Chinese population is to the east of this line, basically in the coast of China, and then this is the river valleys that are most fertile. The Tibetan Plateau and the deserts in the western part of China, very lightly populated. Now, a little bit of historical context, and I've got, and by the way, as far as for the group in terms of distributing the slides, I'd be happy to make a version available that you can share with others. But the first part, and I've got 3 slides of sort of timelines, but one is this idea of this century of humiliation. And you'll hear this from the Chinese, and they'll talk about this is what they're trying to fix. When they go back to before then, they sort of saw themselves as the world's most successful power. Tended to be very dismissive of the Europeans who showed up on their shores trying to trade with them. And in fact, had been incredibly successful in their interactions. Essentially, there was very little they needed from the West. They sold a lot, porcelains, silk, a lot of other things that the Chinese sold. So they had goods going out and silver coming in. But the British and others couldn't figure out ways to get silver, which was the main currency that the Chinese dealt in, get silver out of China. They just didn't have that much that the Chinese cared for. However, and this is a key point, when people hear about the Opium War, sometimes it's like, well, we're stopping the Chinese from selling opium. It's exactly the reverse. This was, the British had discovered that opium generated out of their colonies in India had been something that Chinese were starting to buy. They had figured out how to pull silver out of China. When the Chinese reacted to sort of their opioid crisis of the day, said, we're not doing this. They threw a lot of British opium into the sea and basically triggered a war where the British insisted that they pay for the opium they ruined, continue to buy it, and insisted on, they got the port of Hong Kong, they got a few other ports, they insisted on something called extraterritoriality, meaning the Chinese could not apply their laws to Europeans on their soil, British and then later other European citizens. So the British would decide whether they were going to do anything about their citizens. The only laws their citizens were held to were their own, not Chinese laws. So these were, as you might imagine, tremendous humiliations to the Chinese. There's not much they could do about it. Militarily, they're completely overmatched. If they had been very advanced in other ways, militarily they were incredibly weak and were defeated very handily by the British in the First Opium War and then by European powers in rapid succession over the next 100 years. And that led to a few things. The humiliations and the disruption to the Qing dynasty, the Manchu-led Chinese dynasty of a few hundred years, led to a lot of internal turmoil. And I'll show you some more of these details later. But about the same time as our civil war, there's a major civil war in China as well. So another opium war with the British and the French, another Western intrusion, more extraterritoriality, more treaty ports, more concessions from the Chinese, which led to others in the region to begin to take advantage of them too. The Japanese took over Taiwan, which had been an integral part of the Chinese empire at that point. And then in 1894, you have the first of the Sino-Japanese wars. The Japanese made a fairly dramatic attempt to modernize and westernize starting in the 1840s. And when they attacked China in 1894, and this is really the Middle Kingdom and one of the smaller regional states. I mean, the Japanese were in the Chinese orbit, but they were clearly a subordinate state in the Chinese universe. And for the Japanese to essentially defeat the Chinese military very easily just sort of led to another round of disruptions internally and another illustration of how weak the Qing dynasty had really become. So Japan was able to defeat the Chinese, take control of essentially control of influence on the Korean Peninsula. More internal uprisings and disturbances inside China. That's the Boxer Rebellion. Ultimately, part of the Boxer Rebellion was to try to get rid of foreign influence, to include killing thousands of missionaries and Chinese Christian converts as part of that. And referring back to the Boxers were essentially Kung Fu was the boxer because they fought, and that was kind of their main martial arts technique. But essentially anti-foreigner approaches and anti-foreign ideas. But one of the things they did was lay siege to the embassies, the legations in Beijing, which led to an intervention that included Japanese, Russian, German, British, and American soldiers who went into Beijing to defeat the Boxers and to protect the legations. Within a fairly short period of time after that, the Qing dynasty itself fell. Now, the fact of the matter is, any time a major dynasty has fallen in China over the last 2,000 years, tens of millions of Chinese have died in the upheavals to follow. And this became different. I'll show you a chart here in a little bit. But essentially, in 1911, we lost, the previous dynasty fell apart. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this. We went through about a 40-year period where the Chinese, a lot of internal turmoil, World War I and World War II, before the People's Republic of China was formed and things began to stabilize some. Now, again, there was I won't belabor this too much, but just to highlight that with the fall of the Qing dynasty, this is really when things really completely fell apart, both internally and externally, in terms of how should China be ruled, who would rule, and the powers around China that jumped in to try to take advantage of the situation. In the First World War, there were some more of the issues. The Japanese and the European powers took advantage of China at that time. But what happened internal to China is they began, the Chinese Communist Party was formed in 1921, about the same time as the Russian Revolution. And when they came, they began to compete with another group, the Nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. And essentially from 1927 until 1949, the Chinese Civil War, it basically went on unabated. There was a little bit of a simmering. There was still fighting between the nationalists and the communists. During World War II, nominally, they were fighting the Japanese together. but both were very wary of how much effort to put into the Japanese because it would affect the forces they would have to fight each other. And so both sides tended to be, how you dealt with the Japanese, and that had a lot to do with American frustrations as we wanted China to fight harder against the Japanese, particularly the nationalists, and the nationalists were mindful that the forces they expended on the Japanese might make it harder for them to come back at the communists after the war. So essentially continuous warfare throughout China for that 20-year period, which is particularly horrific. And then finally, the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. But things did not settle down when it came to violence at that point. Fairly shortly thereafter, and by the way, the United States wasn't in favor of the communists taking over. Major recriminations when it was thought that the Americans lost China to the communists because we didn't intervene as forcefully as many thought we should have. An interesting historical what if. But fairly shortly thereafter, with the Korean War, when North Korea invaded South Korea, the United States and China ended up in direct confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. Technically, the Chinese weren't at war. They sent their volunteers to Korea, but the American and Chinese forces were fighting each other in the Korean War. China had issues with Taiwan. I mentioned the nationalists went there. They didn't acquiesce to that, as they've tried a couple times to go back at Taiwan. The Chinese, in addition to participating in the Korean War, shooting at Americans, were also active in supporting the Vietnamese, and particularly with respect to anti-aircraft, and had a lot to do with how the Americans fought the Vietnam War. To avoid what happened in triggering the Chinese in Korea, the Americans made a point of trying not to trigger the Chinese to come in force in Vietnam. Tensions with the Soviet Union, I don't want to skip over, there's also the nuclear tests for so the Chinese are a nuclear power since 1964. I mentioned before about the normalization until 1971. That's when the nationalists had held the UN Security Council seat. We formalized our relations, meaning the United States and the People's Republic of China established formal diplomatic relations in 79. Nixon went to China in 72, for those who remember that overture as part of the Cold War. But since then, in 79, the Congress promulgated the Taiwan's Relation Act, which for all intents and purposes is kind of an alliance in support of Taiwan, the nationalists who are still on Taiwan, although we officially only recognize one China that includes both Taiwan and the mainland. So one country, only one China, our one China policy. I mentioned a couple other things which we'll come back to later. The Persian Gulf War more as a touchstone in terms of what it meant, what the Chinese took from understanding how the world was changing in military capabilities. Tiananmen Square, which I imagine most people have heard of. At about the same time the Soviet Union was collapsing, after about the fall of the Berlin Wall, China had its own moment that could have maybe gone that direction and used the People's Liberation Army to suppress the protesters. The Chinese officially claim hundreds of dead, to include some soldiers and policemen. Unofficial estimates run as high as 10,000 in terms of the number of Chinese killed when the government shut down the protests in Tiananmen Square. The United States objected, did have some concern, some sanctions and restrictions on interaction with China going back to Tiananmen Square, the Tiananmen Square incidents. Of course, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union in the post-Cold War era, and then just as a benchmark, of course, since 9/11, that's also had another effect that in terms of gauging terrorists, which is an area where the United States and China have something in common, since 2001. And of course, we often talk about what can China do to help with North Korea. And just to highlight, the North Koreans have their first nuclear test in 2006 has made stability on the Korean Peninsula more acute since that particular time. I mentioned that time frame and what happened in China, and this whole idea of the mandate of heaven, this idea of, yes, China has routinely had a centralized authoritarian government, usually under the leadership of an emperor with their dynasty, their family, and a very large civil service and court, very well-articulated roles in sort of Confucian ethical hierarchy, establishing how the country is run. But the idea that from the very top, the mandate of heaven goes to the leaders who have that mandate over the people to rule China, but the responsibility to ensure that the people are taken care of. So it's not purely a deference to the emperor. The emperor has a responsibility. And oftentimes it's in those times when the people are not being taken care of in the sense that they have forfeited the mandate of heaven, and then the transitions come. But when all that comes, but when that has happened, as I mentioned, that has usually been a fairly chaotic time in China, whenever the dynasties have changed. I put this slide together partly to sort of capture what this violence meant in China. And I started with the Opium Wars, where you see the actual combatant deaths are only about 18,000, meaning in the Chinese fighting. Overwhelmingly, I think it was a few hundred British dead in that war. Most of those 18,000 are Chinese combatants who died. That Taiping Rebellion, and it was on the conservative side. The low-end estimates are 20 million Chinese died in the Taiping Rebellion. And I won't go into all the details of that, but essentially an uprising. And the Westerners helped put down, meaning American and British and other officers helped the Qing dynasty military defeat the rebels. But by the time it was done in 1864, at least 20 million dead. Now, just as a benchmark, that's the same time as our Civil War, where 750,000 dead are estimated. And we know that was we consider that a fairly cataclysmic event in our history. 20 million in the Taiping Rebellion. Again, smaller in terms of the actual combatants during the Sino-Japanese War. And it's very hard, as I mentioned, in that time frame to separate out World War I, the Chinese Civil War, and World War II. But again, conservatively, over 36 million Chinese dead. And again, combatants, almost 9 million, but the non-combatants suffered grievously, meaning the civilians, because of famine, because of a lot of things. And actually, non-combatants, many of them are killed outright by the Japanese. The Japanese were brutal in the war in China, but the nationalists and the communists were also fairly brutal to populations that they were trying to control. So in addition to sort of the famines, the incredible deaths to the Chinese population. And again, that was just up till the end of World War II, and then the revolution, or the Civil War continues on, at least another 6 million dead. Now, things didn't all get better with the communists coming to power. In fact, many have pointed to Mao as one of the greatest killers in history, as about 40 million Chinese dead related to changes after the People's Republic of China was formed and before things stabilized, probably in the mid-70s, because of collectivization, because of different efforts to change the character of Chinese society, stamp out old culture, the Cultural Revolution, another 40 million or so dead. And again, I put some of the U.S. benchmarks, but all U.S. sort of battle deaths or war-related dead were only about 1.3 million compared to over 109 million, and again, conservatively, Chinese dead since 1842. If you wonder why the Chinese worry about stability, this has a lot to do with that. So I want to talk a little bit, or sort of set the framework in terms of diplomatic, informational, and military and economic power. Probably talk a little bit more about the Chinese than the Americans. I assume you probably have a fair grip on American elements of power, so I won't, although I'll touch on that, I'm not going to spend as much time on theirs. But if I were to summarize some of the key threads of Chinese elements of power, I'll start with the diplomatic one. And I mentioned that sense of the chaos that comes from separation in China. The idea, and they're very sensitive to what belongs, what is part of China, what should be part of China. And right now, some of the key issues that we're aware of, any challenges to Tibet, Hong Kong and Macau, but probably more than any other one right now, since the 70s, is this idea of Taiwan, or really going back to the foundation of the People's Republic. Very sensitive issue, and they use that in their relations with other countries. They have, I forget the number now, we're down to probably a handful of countries that still recognize Taiwan officially, whereas most have acquiesced to the Chinese view that Taiwan does not warrant diplomatic or any other official relations, that only the People's Republic of China speaks for China. One of their other refrains very commonly is against containment, an anti-containment stance, and they're referring to the United States first and foremost. In the latest 19th Party Congress speech by President Xi, he never mentions the United States by name, but he refers to anti-Cold War thinking and alliance systems, and he is explicitly, we know that those are codes, those are getting at the United States. So pushing back on Cold War thinking amongst the Chinese. Informational, this is more sort of, this is more internally focused. The dominance, the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, they do not brook dissent of the party. And when it comes to use of the internet, for example, which is very extensive, but they also have probably the world's most extensive censorship and control system that some refer to as the Great Firewall of China to prevent information from getting in there. And they use their power economically to tell companies you've probably seen in the news, like Google or Facebook, what they can or can't do, what can or can't be posted, the rules of those companies' ability to operate in China. I touched on before a bit about their military, very large. Used to be a fairly unsophisticated military force technologically. That is changing fairly rapidly. They have one aircraft carrier that's operational. They are still sort of in the early years of figuring out how to use it. They have a much smaller nuclear force and a much smaller sort of air force than others, but it is a rapidly modernizing force. And again, I already sort of talked about economics in general terms, and I'll talk more about the Belt and Road Initiative in a moment. But these would be sort of the main elements of Chinese power today. Now, militarily, this just sort of gives a little more fidelity to sort of what those military forces look like. And I did want to highlight the nuclear forces. The Chinese have taken their approach to nuclear weapons was a sufficient deterrent. Their sense that that's enough weapons that will deter others from attacking China. If there was a sense the United States and the Soviet Union, who at peak had operational literally I want to say up to about 20,000 warheads in the Soviet Union and another similar number in the United States, where they talk about mutually assured destruction and a very comprehensive set of weapons. The Chinese had not taken that approach. Theirs has always been a fairly modest-sized nuclear force that's been about that size for several decades. They've modernized it, they've changed the missiles, but in essence, it's a fairly small nuclear force, less than 10% of the size of the U.S. force. And again, if you looked at the numbers of combat aircraft and ships, not quite comparable to the United States, and particularly on the high end when it comes to quality aircraft carriers and some of the higher end ships and some of the higher end aircraft. They don't yet match our capabilities on those, but they're working towards that. I mentioned that although the Chinese do have some forces abroad in peacekeeping missions and in counter-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden, just off the coast of Somalia, the Chinese have very few forces stationed around the world. And as I mentioned, they're one ally on paper. North Korea, there are no Chinese forces stationed there. On the other hand, the United States has a fairly extensive set of deployments abroad. This shows, the bubbles help sort of articulate some of the largest ones, and South Korea and Japan, and then of course in Europe are the main ones in addition to our Middle Eastern deployments. These are, so this gives you a sense of where the United States is. A much more extensive overseas footprint or posture, the Chinese very much less so. Now, by the way, this is kind of a rip from the headlines. It just so happened I got the link this morning to the latest issue of The Economist. And this issue coming out this weekend is on the future of war. And so I pulled this graphic out of one of the articles in this week's Economist that really gets at what's going on in the future of war. And one of the major issues to the Chinese is they know we're around them, and their attempts to try to make it more and more difficult for us to operate close to China. This idea of anti-access area denial and the weapons they have focused on have been meant to keep the United States beyond, if they can, the first island chain, as they refer to, which includes Taiwan. The second island chain actually goes beyond Japan, but these sort of show the United States and its allies in China in the sense of what some of the military posture is in that region. So it is a fairly heavily militarized region. We're clearly not at war with each other, but the adversarial and competitive dynamics are very dangerous in that area. But both the United States and its allies and China have a lot of forces in East Asia. Just to briefly talk about one of the other hot spots, and then just geographically, I'll focus a little bit on Korea. And again, if you look, we know that North and South Korea, this is probably the most dangerous spot on the planet right now in terms of threats. And you've heard a lot on the news about concerns about denuclearization of North Korea. And obviously this is very near to China, and they have a very strong interest in what happens in Korea as well. And partly it has to do with the North Koreans, and in fact this is a little bit dated. They have since the North Koreans have launched missiles that go even further than what's shown in this area. But the North Korean capabilities pose a threat, frankly, to China as well as the U.S. allies in the region, and we now estimate to the United States homeland itself. But this is clearly an important dynamic in our relationship with China. The other one that you hear a fair amount about, and I know last year was one of the lectures, Ambassador Shields talked about the South China Sea and the conflict in this region between this red 9-dashed line that the Chinese claim as their territorial waters and the conflicting claims with neighbors such as Vietnam, the Philippines, and others, Brunei and others who do not recognize it. The United States does not recognize China's claims. And we routinely send U.S. Navy ships through this region in what we call freedom of navigation operations to highlight that these are international waters that are not under control of the Chinese based on our international law, and we do not recognize their claim. And the Chinese have routinely rejected that and see our actions in these freedom of navigation operations as provocative. I won't belabor this slide other than just to briefly highlight kind of what's at the bottom. We've talked a lot about China and the United States, but I've mentioned their allies and our allies and how to sort of capture, if we sort of do the balance of power calculation and say, yes, the United States and China side by side is a fairly daunting prospect for the United States to figure out how do you maintain some sort of superiority over the Chinese individually. But when you add in the United States allies, both economically, militarily, our allies count for really that number, that 58% only applies to the allies listed on this chart. Some estimates say that when you include NATO, all NATO countries, the United States and its allies command over 70 or have over 70% of the defense spending in the world are by the U.S. and its allies. And when you factor in countries like India, which are not included amongst U.S. allies, but nonetheless is probably is more of a China adversary and probably more closely cooperative with the United States right now in military terms, the Chinese are actually fairly heavily outstripped in terms of the capabilities they're bringing to bear and the effort they're putting into defense, particularly when you factor in U.S. allies. Same thing economically. When you realize that whether by purchasing power parity or exchange rate, U.S. and its allies account for over 50%, or correction, a much larger percent, I should say, 50% by exchange rate, but almost 40% by purchasing power parity of the global economy. I do want to spend just a moment to highlight sort of what are major Chinese efforts on economics to expand their influence and strength in their region. And so it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is kind of a simple chart just to show that, and the belt, well, we'll talk about the Silk Road over land and the maritime Silk Road at sea go from Europe, essentially the entire Eurasian landmass touching in Africa and around the Indian Ocean and to China, connecting and building infrastructure projects, creating the mechanisms by which China and all those countries in that region can trade and strengthen their economic abilities. This is a more complicated eye chart version of that, but when you get the slides, what it captures is all the countries that China is interacting with. This is the GDP by the top bar of those countries, such as India over here, and their trade with China underneath. And here again are the same, that maritime Silk Road up to Italy, and then here the land routes all the way up to Europe as well, and the economic infrastructure, or the infrastructure they're building to strengthen the economic ties. This is the #1 sort of Chinese foreign policy initiative, tangible initiative when it comes to influencing others, not just sort of just talking, but in terms of tangible benefits to other countries and to China. Now, I'll take just a moment to summarize at a few slides the official Chinese and American approaches or articulation of their interests. This slide summarizes the People's Republic of China's interests, and this picture and the quotes and most of the information come from the October 2017 19th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the documents that if you want to spend more time on, about a 60-page document, which is the transcript of the 3-hour speech that President Xi gave to the Party Congress, capturing a lot of the top-line ideas that are reflected here. This is a quote from him. But that idea of that century of humiliation and where the Chinese are headed, the Chinese dream of rejuvenation. Rejuvenation, not getting back to where they were, back to where they believe they saw themselves historically, back to where they believe they should be. To get there, priority state sovereignty and the control of the Chinese Communist Party, as I mentioned. Economic development, and when they talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, I mentioned that is about meeting the needs. That other part of the mandate of heaven, if you will, you get the deference to lead that now accrues to the Communist Party and President Xi in particular, but partly the legitimacy to have that power comes from meeting the needs of the people. So the idea of economic development is the core of that. And so that idea of growth and continuing to push economic development, which requires a stable international order. In that regard, the Chinese feel very strongly they are benefiting from the order as it exists. They are a revisionist power. We'll talk about in a moment in some key ways. Meaning they would like to revise the way the international system works, but not in a revolutionary fashion or immediately, given the benefits they accrue from the international system and the way they've connected, particularly economically with the United States and its allies. Strong desire to avoid war, although there are some red lines, the perception that, or the idea that understand that if Taiwan were to declare independence, the Chinese might be willing to launch an attack. But otherwise, they are very much in a defensive. They will assert their prerogatives, willing to use force as they assert, but the idea that they are very unlikely to start a war. They have been internationally, and they have articulated disruptions in the world that they see as, without, again, necessarily naming the U.S. directly, but take advantage of that to offer themselves up to help others, particularly economically, around the world and in every region of the world. And that right now, really, they are emphasizing their economic and diplomatic tools. The question is, how long will that sustain? The goal is that by 2049, and that's the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, that they will be a global leader in national strength and international influence. Now, they will say that doesn't mean they're displacing the United States, but they do see themselves as being a developing country and that they will be a fully mature global leader. In many Americans' analysis, this is directly seen as an attempt to get rid of the United States, displace the United States, although they generally push back on that. The United States National Security Strategy, again, I won't spend as much time on this. This was promulgated in December 2017, just a month or so ago. And the picture in the lower right here is from earlier this week when we had the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General McMaster. He was originally scheduled to fly up here, but because of the government shutdown, that got pushed back, and he instead VTC'd, or did a video teleconference with the students in Bliss Hall to talk about the national security strategy. In general, this captures the themes, President Trump's themes about America first, but frankly, a lot of the details in terms of the pillars tend to look very similar to previous U.S. national security strategies. I want to take a moment from, and by the way, last week, the National Defense Strategy came out. The actual National Defense Strategy, meaning for the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, is a classified document, but there's an 8-page unclassified summary that you can look at on the internet. Between the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, and going back to my point about when we met with the Chinese last week, it does take a fairly hard line, and it tends to talk about China and Russia in the same sentences, being revisionist powers that are challengers, that are our main competitors when it comes to the international system. And it does see them as challenging the world as we would prefer it. The idea that China and Russia want to shape a world antithetical to U.S. values and interests, and China in particular to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Same thing in the National Defense Strategy, and I'll just highlight this last sentence. The most far-reaching objective of this defense strategy is to set the military relationship between our two countries on a path of transparency and non-aggression. It identifies a competitive dynamic, but it does not. But it says we want to try to find ways to avoid war. So, to summarize some of the key competitive elements of the China relationship, as well as some of the areas of confluence. Really, we know on resource competition, human rights, religious freedom, several economic issues, and on some of the local, regional issues such as Taiwan and the South China Sea, the United States and China have very different views. And they are areas of friction and competition in some cases. But again, doesn't necessarily have to lead to war, but these are certainly areas of friction. But what tends to militate against them, By the way, this phrase, responsible stakeholder, was one that had been used by a previous U.S. administration, talking about China rising up as they became more powerful, taking a role in the world as a responsible stakeholder in the world order. Frankly, the Chinese will tend to point to that and say, yes, a lot of what we do is, and they don't use this phrase, is to take an important, valuable role in the global order. And in that regard, they agree with us, and we tend to have a lot of convergence of interests when it comes to the basic order itself, stability, nuclear non-proliferation. They don't agree with the North Korean nuclear program either, and have continued to support increased sanctions in the United Nations, along with the U.S., to try to get the North Koreans to renounce their nuclear ambitions, to denuclearize the peninsula. They have a strong interest in financial stability. As many people are probably well aware, the Chinese are actually either the first or second. It's very close between Japan and China as to who is the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. Now, by the way, that's 6%. About $1 trillion of U.S. debt is held by China and by Japan. Most U.S. debt, or most American debt of the $20 trillion, is actually held by the U.S. government or America. It's only about 30% is by foreigners. Nonetheless, that is a fairly substantial stake for China. The financial stability, to include U.S. financial stability, is important to the Chinese. We mentioned North Korea. We tend to concur on anti-terrorism and radicalism and the dangers to the international system. In general, and obviously in more recent, we removed ourselves from the Paris climate change talks, but nonetheless, both China and the United States have had a strong interest in environmental issues. And in science and medicine, the Chinese and the Americans converge very much. I put this quote here. Just take a moment. We're almost at the last slide here. We should stick together through thick and thin, promote trade and investment, liberalization and facilitation, and make economic globalization more open, inclusive, and balanced so that its benefits are shared by all. We should respect the diversity of civilizations, and in handling relations among civilizations, let us replace estrangement with exchange, clashes with mutual learning, and superiority with coexistence. We should be good friends to the environment, cooperate to tackle climate change, and protect our planet for the sake of human survival. If I threw this up and said, who said this within the last 5 years, you might be surprised to realize this is the Chinese president. Now, how genuine would he be about something like this? Some might dispute, but the words in the Party Congress of global leadership and sort of offering that up has been a fairly prominent Chinese theme of late. This is really my last slide as we move to the discussion, when I think of sort of what are the implications for the United States. The fact of the matter is we are in a very good position. For all the things we've talked about China as a challenge and the way they're rising, there's a certain sort of natural element to that that is not determined to be conflictual. And I think there's a lot of ways we look at how we can work with China. Certainly contest where they challenge our interests and our views, but recognize, and partly why I brought up about our allies and our role in the international system, that we actually have a very important set of advantages. The U.S. developed and led international order is one that China benefits from and has some interest in sustaining, certainly at least portions of. But the other point is there's a lot of other countries around the world who look to the benefits of that system in ways that is really an incredible advantage, to include things like the U.S. dollar being the dominant currency in the world. We can make some of the choices we do because we borrow in our own currency, not anybody else's. And there's tremendous benefits, but that's partly because we're accorded that trust and respect because of how we've been in the world. I've mentioned our competitive advantage with our allies. We have an incredibly strong military. We know, and that Economist article I mentioned is really a fascinating and fabulous sort of take on what some of the challenges are when it comes to near-peer or sort of great power competitors. The idea that technological advantages we've had, the United States and its allies have had for many decades, may be reducing. They're certainly very great right now. The question is, what are things like robotics, artificial intelligence, some of the things going forward, some of the nanotechnology, what do those mean for the future of warfare? And urbanization, for example, in the world in terms of what that might mean. But the bottom line is we have an incredibly strong hand, and we've played it well. We have our moments, but for the most part, we're also pretty resilient in coming back to figure out how to make adjustments. And so with that, I will go ahead and stop, and I think I'll turn it back over to Mike, and we will come back in just a little bit. Thanks.
There's the photograph on the bottom he was talked about earlier.
Thank you for this wonderful presentations. I sure did learn a lot. My question is, one, regards ethnicities in China, especially the Tibetans, the Uyghurs in the western part of China, and as it relates to separatism besides Tibet, is there any separate movement that is trying to kind of go independent?
So the two main ones tend to hear about are the Uyghurs and the Tibetans are the two ones that are most concerned about. And just as a quick note, I mentioned that book, Modern China. It's actually one of my favorite textbooks of the last 10 years or so. But it's built as sort of a graduate level text, so I put it up there. But one of the things in the back is there's a great chart of all the ethnicities. There's 55 recognized minorities in China, but the Han Chinese are still 92% of the population. So it's still by far and away dominant. But the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in the west, the Tibetans, but they're also, and usually separatism they'll tend to also include Taiwan, and anybody there who would dare for independence. They're technically part of China, and so they're very sensitive in the current government in Taiwan, which as part of has had folks who've talked about independence more than some of the other parties. So the Chinese have been very clear that they cannot advocate for independence. They put a lot of pressure on the current government, but that's probably the other big or another significant separatist group. But the others are also Hong Kong and Macau. Where they have sort of a one China, two systems. The idea that they took Macau and Hong Kong with some of their political systems, which were a little more open, and when they connected back to China, and the Chinese Communist Party has done more to sort of clamp down on the actual independence in Hong Kong and Macau. And so separatists, they are also an issue. You've heard about booksellers being spirited off potentially, and that's been in the news. So that's a fairly widespread thing, and I would add one other that doesn't necessarily get as much prominent attention in terms of a current issue, but when they talk about the Korean Peninsula and stability in Korea, and their dominant interest tends to be about stability. They're against the nuclear-armed North Korea, but the idea of the war there and what impacts it might have, one of the major concerns is there's a large Korean population in China, and so the idea of how that would play out in that area. So they're mindful of the disruption of defectors and refugees coming out of North Korea even today. That number has gone up over the last few decades. So not so much as separatist per se, but a concern that they could go that way and that a unified Korea creates some other problem. So in some regards, the divided Korea that's in tension with each other kind of keeps, is sort of keeps one problem at bay. And although they don't like the United States on the Korean Peninsula with the buffer of North Korea, that's been sort of acceptable. But what happens if there is a unified Korea and that Korean population is another one that tends to factor in and not as one of the top line issues when it comes to how they think about Korea. I hope that helps. Sure. Or whoever has the microphone, I guess. There's a hand up here. That's fine.
What are your thoughts about the imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods to kind of level a playing field, given the wide discrepancy between the cost of our labor and the cost of their labor?
I'll have to, that one in terms of the details of the economics, I would say that probably others could speak to more of it. There is a sense, and we've seen a lot of analysis, that since they entered the World Trade Organization and the idea that the United States and others, said that China's participation was based on the idea they would accept the basic rules of free and fair trade. There are many instances or examples of questionable fairness when it comes to the Chinese trade. So in that regard, I think there are mechanisms, and whether through the World Trade Organization or through our bilateral trade negotiations, I think there is fair room to identify. There are several places where their practices, and given that they have a lot of state-owned enterprises, so it's not just about labor prices and labor costs and all that. It's also about how they are able to manage. Can they dump materials, the questions of are they sending the solar panels at prices below what it costs to produce them, to sort of get control of the market. There's a lot of issues where I think the rules of the trade system say that yes, that we should be pushing them to get past, and this is where there's tend to be some forgiveness to developing countries. We've done it for many of our allies. For example, we did it with South Korea. For many years, we accepted that they were a developing country who protected internally in ways that we acquiesced to as they were developing. That in recent years, as they become a more mature, strong, developed country, we've pushed back. Beef would be a good example in South Korea, where we stopped acquiescing to their basically protective tariffs. Same thing with Japan and rice as they became more developed. So I think this is where there's, in a general sense, taking aside whatever other tensions with China, the sense that a developing country being given a little bit more leeway in terms of infant industry protections, and frankly, we did it for our own. Think back to Alexander Hamilton and when we first started out, that we're starting to be less forgiving of the Chinese. So there's a tension of, yes, on paper are they really, or by rule are they violating some of these rules? I think that's been true for a long time. The question is, should we do something about it, and how much should we do about it? They are clearly a valuable trading partner. Their health is valuable to us. How much should we do? So I'm going back to your initial part. I think yes, we should push back on them. I'm not. It partly depends on how that's done. If it leads to a trade war and massive sort of retaliation, there are some really bad things we can both do to each other. And so if I go back to a poor analogy maybe, but if with the Soviet Union it was nuclear weapons were the mutually assured destruction, with the Chinese, we're probably much more entwined economically. The Soviets stayed away from us economically. The Chinese have integrated, and we're now so mutually entwined that trade or an economic war between us will hurt both incredibly, and everybody around us. And so the idea that that's probably the mutually assured destruction more people are concerned about is could the United States and China sort of trample each other or come to just destroy each other's economies while destroying everybody else around them. So I don't know if I addressed it all clearly, but yes.
Why do we have a one China policy? I mean, Taiwan is a separate country. Why don't we recognize them as a separate country?
Because the Chinese have said we can't. No, it's we said we would, part of our negotiations, and this is, so actually I'm looking at the Ambassador Shields over your shoulder. I mean, this is one of these nuances that you're right, the basic logic of it is really kind of tough. But we have these things at time where we sort of have, when we come to what's our official government position, and our official government position is there is only one China, and it includes the mainland and Taiwan, among other things. But at the same time, we have an act, the Taiwan Relation Act, which in everything but name treats Taiwan as a separate country. We do not have an embassy there. We have an interest section. We do not have an alliance with them per se, but we sell arms to them and we have military attachés there. We have a Taiwanese officer in the U.S. Army War College class almost every year, and he is never referred to by rank, and his flag is not included on any of the displays. He is Mr. So-and-so from Taiwan, but he is not from the country of Taiwan. He is not whatever his rank is in their military. I mean, there's these things, so we've got these ways around it. And then the Chinese have advocated, when we have these mill-to-mill interactions, we have a law, the National Defense Act of 2000, which says we cannot have a Chinese student from the People's Republic of China as a student in the class. There are restrictions on many things we can do. We cannot educate them. So for all the other countries that we have, we were not going to have an officer from the People's Liberation Army. Now, if that act changed, because this happens with other countries, and the PLA was said, hey, we can have, if our law said we could have an officer from the PLA would probably turn around and say, not until you get rid of the Taiwanese officer, because that's what they do to other countries, that they will not have, a Chinese, or a People's Republic of China and a Taiwanese officer in the class. That's a recognition that they won't accept. So that's a long way of saying we've got an official policy. The Chinese aren't happy with it. They point out the contradictions themselves. We have said, hey, we could resolve this, just make them a separate country. The Chinese have said that's one of their red lines. They would fight. They've told the Taiwanese that independence is, that's something they would fight over. Whereas in the past, I mentioned that third Taiwanese Strait crisis, we sell, I don't think we necessarily literally sell the carriers through the Taiwan Straits. We may have in '96. But there's a sense that we can't do that anymore. What the Chinese did in that third crisis, nobody died in that crisis. The previous two, lots of people died. Shellings between the nationalists and the communists. In the 96 crisis, what the Chinese did, the People's Republic of China launched a lot of missiles into the sea near Taiwan. And then we sent carrier battle groups into the area. I think, and like I said, just off the top of my head, I can't remember if we went through the straits or very close. But the sense of a lot of the Chinese advances, the anti-access area denial, sending something through the straits now would be a much more dangerous proposition than it was in the 90s. And would the Chinese be willing to use that? And this was a sense of they don't want a big war, but there's some things they care about. Would that be a trigger? So one of these sort of areas where they feel strongly enough about would they actually use force first and maybe start shooting conflict when it became a full-scale war or not. But so that's probably, so I can give you the official policy. Ambassador, would you like to add anything on that? Or okay, sorry.
Yes. What is China's justification for their claim on the South China Sea? And are we the only ones that are unhappy about it?
No, we're not the only ones unhappy with it. If I read the timelines right, in 2009, they kind of came and said, hey, this is our territory. Now, they've made these claims that it's always been that way. Some of this goes back, I mentioned Tibet, Xinjiang, some of these areas that, at different points in Chinese history, when they were actually under control of the dynasty, the emperor seated mainly in Beijing in recent centuries. But in terms of some of these areas, I mean, frankly, there are parts of what are now Russia that were parts of the Chinese empire. But they haven't pushed claims on those, but every now and then they've made statements about it. The idea of the South China Sea, there's claims that in some ancient times that was essentially Chinese territory. There were, and I'm not an expert on this era, but there was a book called 1491, but the idea that Chinese fleets used to routinely course through the South China Seas and the Indian Ocean, that they had large oceanic fleets that were making runs. There are, statement of fact, large Chinese ethnic communities in most of the countries around the Indian Ocean and that South China Sea area. Large trading posts when they set up and they stayed and they've been there for centuries and centuries. So the idea that as the dominant power, the hegemon in that region, that sea was basically a Chinese sea at that point. It would, in practical terms, it might be more like Monroe Doctrine Caribbean to us. In terms of, hey, that's just, we don't want any other great power in there messing around. This is our area of the world, without declaring the Caribbean and all American waters. They've that's the way it was for a long period of time, but this idea of sort of a formal claim, an actual territorial waters claim, that's a bolder claim. And we've rejected it. The countries in particular that I mentioned there that have conflicting claims have rejected it. I'm trying to remember the exact tribunal. There's a UN tribunal. The Philippines essentially took the Chinese to court. The Chinese refused to recognize jurisdiction, so they didn't participate in the hearing. But the International Tribunal said the Chinese claim does not have merit. So there is a standing one out there, but then the Philippines government had changed, and the current Philippines president has not been challenging China the way the previous Philippine government did. So no, we're not the only ones. But the idea of could they enforce it? They've been building what were not recognized. So they have now islands. Their islands mean something in international law that are entitled to territorial waters. Those were rocks, which had no matter who owns them, they weren't entitled to territorial waters claims or even extended economic zone claims. But the Chinese are now saying those are islands and they are entitled to the legal standing in ways that we don't accept, and I'm not sure any other countries do accept. But again, there's just one of these, in the current international order, with the current treaties on the law of the sea, the UN UNCLOS, I remember the acronym, on the law of the sea, which we actually haven't actually ratified, but we uphold as customary international law in large regard. The idea that this is one of these places where if the Chinese were able to sort of make modifications just de facto to the international order, this is one, where could they actually enforce control over the South China Sea? So legitimacy in international terms, no. They've been very strident in asserting their claim, but they haven't done anything really. They haven't thwarted our freedom of navigation. They complained about it. They say things to our ships as they go through in our aircraft, but they haven't shot at them, and they haven't driven them off. Although they have done things like that, they've used their Coast Guard to push fishing vessels out from other countries and to push back on the Japanese and some other islands So, but they haven't done anything to challenge us. The question is, would they if they felt more confident in their naval abilities? Sure.
Their presentation covers defense strategy, security strategies. From all of us who listen to all of the talking heads on TV and whatever, and then we read papers, can you identify 1, 2, or 3 areas where we should go and really emphasize our relationship with China, and 2 or 3 that should not be touched, especially in terms of this nationalistic or current administration's approach to diplomacy? You know, where should we not go, and where should we go in terms of our emphasis?
With China, or in terms of in our relationship with, or how we
China,
interact
with China.
So probably some of the plus areas where we have sort of endorsed their positive contributions, and one where, frankly, the War College has had a role, or has a sort of a coordinating role in that. It has to do with peacekeeping operations. The Chinese have taken a much more active role in United Nations peacekeeping operations. Now, the United Nations, or the United States, as one of the permanent members of the Security Council, has a lot to do with the endorsement and support of any peacekeeping mission that the United Nations does. The United States chooses not to generally deploy troops in large number, so we'll send observers and sometimes staff members to help out with UN missions. But there's no UN peacekeeping mission that the United States hasn't acquiesced to, since we're a permanent member of the Security Council, and we can veto anyone. Same thing with China. In the past decade or so, the Chinese have become more active in actually helping, and the main places they've been are in Africa. They've been in Lebanon, if you're familiar with the peacekeeping mission there. They've been in South Sudan. That's their largest peacekeeping mission right now. And they have a peacekeeping center in Beijing, and in fact, that was one of our stops last week when we were there. And so one of the members of our Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute here at Carlisle Barracks was part of that delegation. We have had probably at least twice a year, we've had interactions with the People's Liberation Army. This is an area where the United States and China do agree. So that's one. And I would extend on the military side, another one we've had a common interest is the anti-piracy mission off the coast of Somalia. If you recall the shipping lanes that were being attacked by Somali pirates, Chinese ships participate in the anti-piracy operations there. And in recent years, Chinese ships have even participated in a Pacific-wide exercise called RIMPAC for short. I can't remember the Rim of the Pacific country, but essentially U.S. Pacific Command with a lot of our other allies and partners runs these exercises, and the Chinese have participated there. And the last one, so peacekeeping, anti-piracy, and really humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, particularly in East Asia. These are areas where we frankly have worked together at the operational and tactical level, and policy-wise agree that these are areas where the Chinese and the United States interests tend to line up, and that's been fairly positive. And in Korea, there's actually been policy-wise a lot of overlap. We agree on the policy of denuclearization. The Chinese have supported all the sanctions policy-wise. Question of how well they've been in enforcing the sanctions in terms of what goes across their border into North Korea, since they have the largest border with North Korea. That's a different matter. The question is how much of that is understood by the country, and how much of that is, Chinese people who can thwart sanctions, in the same way that we can't have problems with controlling our southern border. It's not about what the countries want; it's what people can do. But now in terms of staying away from, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I was trying to think of what that would mean. Did you have an idea yourself about what might be an example or thought in?
Forcing the issue on the one or two China.
Yeah, so that's one well, there's a good example. So during, I remember the timing of the phone call with the Taiwanese president. That was after election and before inauguration for President Trump. He did seem to send that signal. So he took a call from the Taiwanese leader, and that immediately got a response from the Chinese. And by the time he became president, the idea that President Xi wasn't talking to him until there was some sort of reinforcement on that. So there was, since that President Trump may have been moving that direction, and people in his entourage may have felt that might be a way to go. Could have been, could still be similar to what happened with Israel and Jerusalem. and that was a campaign statement, or there's a sense there were people who thought that would be something that's not, but I don't think President Trump himself as a candidate ever made an explicit statement about endorsing Taiwanese independence. But the idea that that might have been on the table. The Chinese the People's Republic of China pushed back kind of hard, and it appears, President Trump certainly hasn't challenged it so far as president. So if that appears to be, he's held back. We've sold arms to them. That happened under President Obama. There was arms sales. So we are still doing things the Chinese disagree with. So we haven't stayed away from that completely. But the idea of endorsing Taiwan as a separate country, we haven't sent that signal, and the Chinese have sort of sent us very strong pushback to deter us from doing that. I can't think of any other sort of no-go terrain. Sir? Oh, trade war, that one it seems like a good point. So there was a sense, and many people say, and I think it was in the article that was available for this one, that the United States and President Trump had emphasized North Korea as the most significant issue in that part of the world. And that's an area where we're looking for Chinese cooperation. So if there was a sense that we would prefer for them to help us there, so we weren't going to make an issue of trade. Now, there's a sense that the Chinese haven't been as successful, certainly as the president hoped they might be, in influencing North Korea. So if there's a sense that, okay, well, if we couldn't really do that, if there was an implicit potential quid pro quo, you help us with North Korea and we'll sort of lay off, we'll ignore the trade stuff for now. There are indications now that the administration is coming back to the trade issues and starting to move into sort of more confrontational. So if that was kind of to encourage cooperation on North Korea, we'll set the trade things off to the side. Although we still sort of cooperate, we still want their cooperation, and by policy, we still do agree on on what should happen with North Korea. If there's a sense that China's not doing as much as we had hoped they would, or what we hope or expect them to do, now the trade things are coming back, and that may no longer be a check on conflict in that area. So I think that's one that's evolving. There does appear to be more trade friction coming up, that there are clashes in that realm. Those are the main ones I can think of right now. Give this more time, I might think of some others. But thank you.
As a peer competitor with China, in addition to some of the vulnerabilities we've already spoken about, are there others? For example, our national debt. Apparently, we owe a fairly large percentage of our national debt to China.
Yeah. The thing on the national debt, I'm personally, and again, I'm not an economist, but I've had a fair amount of economics training. Some of the concern about our debt is a bit overblown. Our national debt is not that bad compared to many others in the world. Now, China's national debt's like 16% of their gross domestic product. Ours is 70% of our gross domestic product. And this is where, this is the debt held by the public. For example, part of our national debt, so if you use the big number, the 20 trillion, which is a little over 100% of our GDP, that also includes all the money invested in it by the Social Security Trust Fund. So this is money the U.S. government owes to another part of the U.S. government. Mutual funds in the United States own more of our national debt than the Chinese do. If you break down our national debt and look who owns the national debt, and frankly, it's partly the reason we've been able to promulgate that debt is because we're a good bet. We are a very stable economy. Our rule of law, our system of transparency for our economy is very good. It's why the UN, as big as their economy is, it's still state-controlled. Their currency, which floats more, so they have actually done more to let their currency react on the international market. There are still state-owned organizations. There's problems with rule of law. If the Communist Party, in other words, rule of law on paper, and actually President Xi emphasizes strengthening rule of law, but the sense that corruption, and he is undertaking a major anti-corruption campaign internal to China. But it sort of indicates this is one of those areas why others are reticent about how much do you trust China. For all the problems in the United States, we're very trustworthy when it comes to if you put your money in, you leave it there for a long period of time, you're going to get the expected return on investment. So buying U.S. Treasury bonds is still a fairly safe bet. Our interest rates are stable, our inflation is stable. The United States economy is an incredibly powerful, well-respected engine in the world. So our debt was partly a reflection, it got part of the way it is because people are willing to lend for the right reasons to the United States. And our vulnerability because of it, in other words, any of the people holding that debt don't really have that much immediate leverage. Now, could the Chinese, with their 6% of our debt, their I think last number I saw, $1.2 trillion, trade bills, cause damage? Sure. and they'd pay the price, and potentially even worse than we would, if they were to try to, let's say, unload all of their debt. But again, so it's not that it's insignificant, but our debt is probably, and again, it tends to be more of a political football than in terms of pure economics, how dangerous is our debt to our country. Now, long term, we've made commitments, and that's when we say, what happens when we are paying on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, decades out into the future, is that sustainable? Most people say no, but of course, if you look back 30 years, that unsustainable period should have already happened, but we keep making adjustments. And so, although it may not be the most coherent long-range approaches, the crises people saw 20 years ago haven't happened yet, and a lot of times because we do make some of those adjustments, and we have a fairly resilient and strong economy. So that is, I'm not poo-pooing it at all. Not that there's, say that there's nothing to be concerned there, but I don't think it's as much of a concern in terms of what could the Chinese do to us. Given their proportion, again, like I said, the Japanese have about as much. All foreign holdings are about 30%, I think I read. 6 trillion of that 20 trillion are held by foreigners. But again, why they hold it in the first place is a lot about why we're a good investment. I'm not sure if that helps completely.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, you mentioned that China was taking advantage of our distractions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth to pursue closer ties and agreements with Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia. And one of the things that my husband and I have noticed, the same conversation coming up with friends from Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, where they say that our reputation's declining in these countries economically, militarily, our relationships with them economically and militarily. And so they have found that that they're having to have closer ties with China, and that these ties are almost like a necessary evil. They'd actually prefer not to. They'd rather that we stepped up and came back to them, right. But here they are. That's what they need to do. So my question really is, do we have strategic interest, and do we have strategic plans to reverse that trend?
That, honestly, I can't say that and this would be two parts. Government-wise, I can't really say. Right now, we know we've moved away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership is one that I think on balance, the Chinese would assess that was to their benefit for us to step back. In other words, now as far as what the Chinese are facing, the Japanese and the other countries didn't give up on that pact. It doesn't include the United States. So the idea that there is a vulnerability, this goes to the part about where does the investment come from. Most of the countries that China has invested in tend not to benefit in the ways of this. So China has tremendous assets, but they tend to come and extract and extract value based on that. When they make their investments, they expect the resource in return. They often don't develop the areas where they go. They bring their own labor in to do it, and they extract the resources, and usually at very favorable conditions. That includes places like North Korea, where they extracted a lot of the resources at very favorable prices and to very little benefit to the North Koreans. Same thing in Central Asia. So the Chinese have proven are not necessarily the most, one of the greatest ways to get people to turn against the Chinese, to have the Chinese spend a lot of time with them and invest in them. So at some level, until the Chinese figure out how to be a more benevolent, and friendly, and they talk about win-win all the time, but in reality, their economic posture tends to be unbalanced toward the Chinese. So just on the side of the Chinese and what it's doing to allies, and that the others would probably prefer us or someone else. And there are others, not just the United States, out there that can sort of help out where the Chinese are at this point. But they do have money. They have a lot. They're awash in cash. In addition to what they've paid to get our treasuries, the part of the debt, they've got a lot more. So they've got cash out there looking in ways to invest. And so in that regard, it's a wise thing if you're another country to figure out ways to, hey, if we can get capital from the Chinese to pursue things that are useful to us. Now, sometimes it is negative because it goes to corruption and nothing useful for the population or the country as a whole. But at some level, it's something that the Chinese can do for the global order that might be a positive thing. So I won't say that the Chinese are a purely negative force economically in the world. But in terms of what we're doing strategically, I'm not clear about where the government is headed. The president has said things. Obviously, trade pacts are a big issue, but trade pacts were probably the way in which, if I did that regression to the mean part about our 5% of the world economically, between NAFTA, we are agreed with the European Union and other, our free trade association with the South Koreans. I mean, these are areas where our trading networks are almost as, or probably just as valuable in other ways as our military alliances. Those are still there, so that's still a very positive thing. But I'm not sure about, some of the, how much those might be affected by some of the changes in vision. So keeping what we have is still a good thing. We sort of stopped going forward with that. The question is, where might we go in the future? But the other part is, unlike the Chinese, we're overwhelmingly, and they're getting more privatized. A lot of our market is not about the government. And in that regard, we still have tremendous influence because we still have some of the most dynamic, non-governmental entities on the planet when it comes to economics. Microsoft, Apple, Boeing, all these in terms of what influence they have beyond what our government does is still something that is, I think, has a positive impact for what it means. Like I said, even without our government, the United States is still a pretty desirable partner with, aside from the government, the United States is a very powerful partner for the world. So I hand over here. Oh, yes.
What will the ramifications be in the region, specifically in China, when North Korea implodes?
When North Korea implodes? Interesting question. Well, I won't necessarily ignore that. We've thought North Korea was going to implode going back to the end of the Cold War. There's an assumption that, and they have been amazingly resilient. One of our visits last week in South Korea was actually to make that point of, this is a pretty resilient place. I mean, they're incredibly poor, but they've managed to make do in ways that, given what other countries have been through, that's one of the question marks. It's like, how could they possibly keep surviving this incredibly difficult set of circumstances domestically? So in terms of would they implode, we'll put aside they haven't imploded when we thought they would, and there's no evidence that they were about to. Could they? Maybe, but I wouldn't assume that they will implode. One of the premises of our research project was one of the possible outcomes might be what you call the Germany benign solution. It's like, hey, North and South Korea just just decide to get back together. No war, no shooting, and we know that how hard it was for the West Germans with about 4 times the population and twice the competence of the economy to absorb East Germany. When in South Korea, it's a much smaller. It's only a 2-to-1 population and a 50-to-1 economic difference. Just the cost of that benign one are incredibly difficult. So the Chinese, the South Koreans both tend to worry about if there is even that benign, if that's particularly if the restrictions on personnel movement, the idea that refugees will flow or North Koreans will flow to better economic opportunities, that many more would flow to China. And it's hard to go to South Korea right now because the demilitarized zone is literally so dangerous that it sort of would push most stuff north, at least in the short run. But even so, there's 22 some odd million North Koreans. They estimate that high levels of refugees might be 2 million. That's disruptive without necessarily imploding China. So it partly depends on how North Korea goes. With a war that somehow the United States and China get into, I think what both sides are concerned about is who controls the nuclear weapons. The idea that would a faction, even if the government went, would there be a rogue faction that had the nuclear weapons? What happens to those? Would there be groups that would take to the mountains? So any of the violence is what both North and South Korea, or China and South Korea, and us and the Japanese and others are most concerned about. But you asked specifically, what will China do when they implode? Was the key point. My sense is they're going to try to figure out how to keep the lid on as best they can. And the main thing that we anticipate that they will do, because they already do it, is try to prevent the refugees from coming into North Korea. So even if North Korea suddenly said they're fine with people leaving, China's unlikely to let them flow in. And how strongly they would be on their border to sort of control whatever flows of people. That'd probably be the main thing they're concerned about, is to contain any instability to North Korea. Don't let it bleed over into China. That's their first thing in just about any scenario we've talked about. And I don't see that changing, whether they implode or just benignly sort of decide to reunify with the South.
Sir Mary Foster, as a strategist, does the possibility of China pocketing Russia and increasingly isolated Russia as an ally worry you at all? And if not, why not?
This is one of those where it's very much a personal opinion sort of thing. So not the government is like, my think is, I think Russia's a liability in large regard. I mean, the Russians, so I think China and Russia have more that's likely to lead them to conflict in many regards. Any of their relationships have tended to be short-term expedient sorts of things. There's a part of me feels like they're a liability to China, a drag on China, so that if they really were sort of more closely connected, the Chinese would end up just absorbing more of the what are the major problems with Russia right now. And I see that more on the economic side. Militarily, if there were, the worst case, or the nightmare scenario there is the Russians do have a capable military. I mean, their economy is really going the wrong direction. Their demographics are going the wrong direction. If I did this as a three-way, a thing of Russia, China, and the United States, how much do you worry about the largest geographic country in the world with its 120 million people and declining, and their economy that's declining, and the other things that are declining? It's like Russia's going the wrong way. Their danger is that they'll do something and lash out while they're going the wrong way. But in terms of what can China do to sort of leverage them, or what link? There's a part of me is not sure what benefit. They were staving off conflicts in other areas. There's a question some people bring up: would the Chinese actually at some point want to reassert their claim to the eastern parts of Asia that used to be more in the Chinese order? And in fact, inside Russia, those are more ethnic Chinese. Many parts of that area, as I understand it, are more Chinese ethnic than they are Russian or any other more traditional Slavic folks. So, in terms of that sort of, minus the, like I said, the purely military lines at this moment in time, the Russians and the old Soviet military on the nuke front, and space-wise, the Russians are much more advanced than the Chinese. One of the areas of cooperation with the Russians is they still get we still work very closely with them for things in space. They have some technological things that are well advanced over China, but the question is how long that sustains. I guess in a general axis turn, it doesn't worry me too much. Can they take advantage? In other words, I'll give you a different negative view. Is that if Russia were to do something in the Baltics or Eastern Europe that triggered NATO to get involved, that could well be seen as an opening for China. That might well be something they would take advantage of. And the other way around. If something, let's say that China actually did fight over Taiwan and we somehow ended up, even in a sort of low-level or regional military conflict with China, that might be an opening for Russia. So whether they explicitly coordinated or were just sort of both mindful of looking for openings where, if the United States is kind of the one keeping things in check, if they have to use, and I say Russia and China both operate in gray zones and hybrid warfare below the threshold of open combat, because open combat right now is a foregone conclusion. The United States damages them very badly, we win, sort of thing. Is that nonetheless, if you have these opportunities where the United States is distracted and can't bring its attention, and they can take advantage of this, I think both China and Russia have versions of that. The Russians have been more belligerent and have done more negative things militarily, cyber-wise, trying to undermine information ops. They have much more malign information operations than what the Chinese do. The Chinese are overwhelmingly defensive about keeping information out, but they haven't tried to undermine our elections or things like that, like the Russians have tried to do. So can they do things together? Maybe. Would they coordinate? Maybe. But Russia itself, worried about so that alignment. Not quite as much, but I can see some negative ways in which the two reinforce or create in combination tremendous problems for the United States and its allies.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it's this young man back here.
Thank you very much. In the area of vulnerabilities that China might be in well, I have to push a button or get closer. Get it closer. In the area of vulnerabilities that we have that China might be in a good position to exploit, could you comment on risks to our power grid from pulse weapons and cyber war, which appears to be ongoing right now?
You want to cyber war ongoing by them, by Russians, or just more in generally? Oh, you were talking. So as far as they're not just attacking our infrastructure, but the idea that they are actually the one area probably that has been most talked about in terms of Chinese cyber wars, that raiding industrial secrets, intellectual property. That the Chinese, both above board in terms of the way they coerce companies, that if you want to operate in China, you have to share your intellectual property with them in ways that now that they tend to take advantage of, versus just, and as well as illicitly, sort of going through by cyber or other means, just espionage to get particularly economic secrets. And in that regard, yes, I endorse that there is certainly efforts by the Chinese, both cyber and other, trying to gain knowledge about how we operate economically and militarily, frankly. I'm sorry, ask you, say again the first part of your question, or the way you framed it? Oh, touch of the power grid. Yeah, that, I can't, that, I'm not an expert in that. I'm not sure how relevant. I mean, and I kind of, in my head, I kind of go back to Cold War eras. I was, an artillery guy, and we had nuke artillery back then. And we spent a lot of time, we had specific bands that were hardened against electromagnetic pulse and the sense of how vulnerable some of these things were to that. And that is still out there. I've heard things about high airburst, EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapons, and what that might do. I don't have, my sense is that is a real threat. It can really do some incredible damage. Ironically, when I have read some of these nightmare scenarios and sort of gone through some of these, what could happen, and that goes all the way back to when we were looking at what the Soviets could do, what would happen to the United States in an actual nuclear exchange. Ironically, one of the benefits of the United States is that we're so radically decentralized. So the idea of part of our resilience is that it's not that coherent a system in the first place. Now, there are central nodes and things like that, but so, that's kind of an odd way of saying, if we were worried that there's just one or two nodes you take out, it's like, we're not sure about that. We have a sense that there's a lot of ways that we can function and the way that system, so to say it's vulnerable, it's dangerous, not to be dismissed as a significant thing, but how much can they really do? And oh, by the way, if attributable, and this is a key element, I think if attributable, most of our adversaries are even more vulnerable than we are in some regards. And then in China in particular, with that almost 1.4 billion people and the way their country functions, there's a sense of that if we thought it was them or knew it was them that were coming after us, the sort of reciprocal damage we could do, retaliatory damage we could do, is probably disproportionate to what they could do to us. And so this goes more to sort of resilience, all this. So it's significant, but I can't speak to the technical details, and I can't say how much worse it's gotten. Like I said, my perspective on it has sort of, as I've watched over time, some of it, I've looked at the redundancies, and as we ran into the problems, 9/11 was a good example. When the World Trade Center, it turns out there were a lot of nodes there, and sort of how that played out. There were some interesting dynamics which showed how quickly we could rewire around some of the things there. So it's potentially fraught, but we've got some pretty, I think, we have reasons to be, well, again, saying would not be the right answer, but I think we could probably deal with a lot of them. I haven't, so I'm keep studying it, but I don't have a technical answer for it. But I also, since we're not as vulnerable to a silver bullet kind of attack, other than massive nuclear attack is the one that you sort of really can't, that's the one real standing one. Well, actually, I hate to end on that note, though. So let me say something, because I had to, how are we going to survive thermonuclear attack? No, this is, I'm actually upbeat about the one thing that never came up, and I was kind of surprised. I kind of deliberately avoided it until this moment. This is the idea that there's some sort of, Thucydides trap with China, that we're, as China's a rising power and us as the sort of the dominant power in the world, that we would want to thwart them. My sense is that's a bit of a red herring. That there's some evidence that in history, rising powers and the dominant power tends to confront a rising power with war. But there's a version of Thucydides, if you read in there, one of the more salient points of Thucydides has any war is bad. What the worst things in there was not the war between Sparta and Athens, it's the way society broke down in Greece. The Chinese are pretty mindful of what happens when you take the lid off society. Chinese society is, the deaths in China when chaos or when stability falls apart are incredibly high. They know that, they don't have an incentive to trigger that, nor do we. And in that regard, I think both countries are more prone to try to figure out ways to do this without war. And so the idea that there's some sort of natural inevitability about rising powers in this era, given the things we do, I am more hopeful than I am concerned about the future of U.S.-China relations. I think we can figure out a way. Both are incredibly successful societies that have benefited from a world that is sort of open and connected, and not from. And in fact, neither stands to benefit from warfare in any way that you can think of in most other areas, where just seizing territory and people was your path to economic improvement. Doing it violently was a really cool and sometimes easy way to do it. That is not the model anymore for China or us. So that's a long way of saying I'm less concerned about the conflict side than the ways that we can figure out. That we'll be mindful of those and figure out how not to get into wars or any major conflicts, and we're more prone to focus on how we can advance both sides' interests in ways that we can coexist. Let me end with that rather than the other.
I'd like to thank Dr. Lacquement very much for his very enlightening presentation, and please accept this small token of our appreciation. Thank you very much.